Hi, in this video we're going to look at a type of argument that every philosopher needs to know about, the deductive argument.
Geometry a pill of his own free will, on half of one shiny was particularly ill. Later they say he could sing it away, half a grade of whiskey every day. Aristotle was a bagger for the bottle, Hobbes was fond of his dram, and Rennie Descartes was a drunken fart. I drink, therefore I am.
In philosophy, it's important to distinguish different types of argument. This helps you understand them better. If you understand how they work, the various different types and their differences in how they work, it helps you criticize them, because some methods of criticizing arguments will work for some types and some for other types. As far as the A-level syllabus is concerned, there are three fundamental types of argument in philosophy: a deductive argument, inductive argument, and abductive argument, which is also known as the argument to best explanation. And we'll be looking at all three of these in a series of videos. Whilst the A-level syllabus distinguishes the three types of argument, in the history of philosophy, the amount of different types of argument and how they distinguish from one another has been somewhat disputed. Famously, the great philosopher David Hume only recognized two types of argument, the deductive and the inductive. And there are people, scholars today, who may argue that our third category, abductive argument, is really just a type of inductive argument. We needn't concern ourselves too much for now. As far as the A-level is concerned, there are three different types, and that is what we'll be looking at, one after the other. And we're starting today with deductive argument. So before we review the definition of a deductive argument, let's just review our general definition of an argument. It'll be helpful for what we're about to discuss. So as we saw in video 2, an argument is a set of propositions put forward to establish the truth of a further proposition. And these sets of propositions have the special names that we discussed. The set of propositions you're putting forward to try and establish the truth of a further proposition, we typically call them the premises or the reasons sometimes. And the proposition we're seeking to establish the truth of, to prove that, we call that the conclusion. So in an argument, you have your premises, and with those seeking to sort of rationally establish the conclusion. So here we have our definition of a deductive argument. So what is a deductive argument? A deductive argument is an argument put forward to establish its conclusion as certainly true. And that not every argument is put forward to do that, and we're not going to spend time thinking about other types of argument today, but we will see in time that other arguments may not necessarily be put forward to establish their conclusion as certainly true. Maybe they seek to establish their conclusion perhaps only as probably true. And so this does distinguish a certain class of argument. They are put forward to establish their conclusion as certainly true. Now, of course, they may be flawed. There may be problems with the deductive argument we're considering. They may indeed fail to establish the conclusion as certainly true. Many philosophers may put forward deductive arguments that contain some flaw, have some problem. We'll look at some of the problems these arguments may have as we go on here in this video. But the intent is to establish the conclusion with certainty, and draw our conclusion, certainly establish its truth with certainty. So let's see how this works. Let's look at some examples of deductive argument. Here's the first argument we're going to see. So first premise in this argument, Socrates is a man. Second premise, all men are mortal. And conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now this is an argument. We can see, we grasp the idea of an argument. You have the conclusion there, Socrates is mortal, and those two premises, well, they support that. They attempt to prove that conclusion. And what distinguishes this as a deductive argument? Well, we can see that if you accept the first premise, Socrates is a man, and if you accept the second premise, all men are mortal, then the conclusion does follow with certainty. You can conclude Socrates is mortal. Sort of, if you accept premise 1 and premise 2, there's sort of no way out. There's no escape. You have to accept Socrates is mortal. There's no objection you can make at that stage. Now, of course, you can criticize this argument in other ways. I mean, you could, for example, say, well, I don't agree with that argument. I don't like that. I don't agree with that conclusion. And for example, I think Socrates is a woman, actually. So this argument's inaccurate on that basis. So you can sort of refuse to accept, or you can criticize the premise and say, oh, I don't accept the premise, or either premise 1 or premise 2. However, if you do accept premise 1 and you do accept premise 2, then you must accept the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. So we could say that the conclusion does follow with certainty here in this argument. Further, let's look at another example. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris, Paris is in France, and therefore the Eiffel Tower is in France. So once again, if we were looking at, why is this deductive? What does this fit our definition? We saw that deductive arguments are those put forward to establish their conclusion with certainty. Well, again, although there are many ways you may want to dispute or argue about premise 1 or premise 2, although they do look true from where I'm standing, but in theory, objections could be raised. With that aside, if you do accept premise 1, if you accept, yes, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, and you do accept premise 2, that Paris is in France, then you must accept, with certainty, the Eiffel Tower is in France. And and there are other types of argument that aren't deductive, where you may accept the first premise and the second premise, but you don't necessarily need to accept the conclusion. In a deductive argument, at least the aim is the arguments put forward to have this sort of certainty in the way the conclusion follows from the premises. So we're going to look now at further classifying deductive arguments. There are different types of deductive argument in turn, and we can discuss and talk about and expected to know about, according to the A-level syllabus, invalid deductive arguments, valid deductive arguments, and sound deductive arguments. So what are the differences with these? What do these words mean? So we're going to look at first validity as a concept, what a valid deductive argument is. As we know here, all deductive arguments are intended to be valid deductive arguments, and they're the arguer or the proponent of the argument is intending that they function as valid arguments, but sometimes there are flaws in arguments, mistakes that the philosopher, the arguer, has made that sort of hold them back from being valid. So what is validity? Well, this word, as I know elsewhere, can be used in different ways in English, and it seems very common amongst students and people who are coming to philosophy for the first time, when they hear about something being a valid argument, just thinking that means it's a good argument, or it's valid, that argument is. In other words, it is acceptable, or it's one you would recommend, or it's plausible, or it has some merit, or it's well put together. But in philosophy, we have a very specific definition of this, which is not quite the same as that general usage in English, and is the following. A valid deductive argument is an argument where, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. It doesn't actually say in the definition that the premises must be true. It just says in a valid deductive argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And the examples on the previous slide are all valid deductive arguments. So Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. That is a valid deductive argument. In fact, discussing that argument, I went through the process of showing that, because we saw how if you accept that Socrates is a man, and if you accept that all men are mortal, then you must accept that Socrates is mortal. So it meets that definition of validity, because if the premises are true, in other words, if you accept these premises, if they are true, then the conclusion must be true. You must acknowledge that Socrates is mortal. And not all deductive arguments are valid. Not all have this feature. The intent when you put forward a deductive argument is that they will be valid. The people who put them forward want the reasoning to flow logically, so to reach the conclusion in this way. But sometimes there are flaws in the argument. Sometimes they aren't valid, and we can call those arguments, those deductive arguments, invalid deductive arguments, and they're sort of defective. They contain some kind of flaw, and it's not really worth very much, because they sort of lack this logical property. To expand on what validity and its implications, here, as noted, sort of in slightly informal way of thinking about validity is that if we say something has validity, it means that the conclusion follows from the premises. We could look at an example here. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Premise 1. Premise 2. Paris is in the UK. Conclusion. Therefore, the Eiffel Tower is in the UK. Now, I doubt anyone with a basic knowledge of geography would accept that argument. It's not a good argument. It's not one you would want to accept. However, according to our definition, it is valid. It is actually a valid argument. It's not a sound argument. We'll come to what a sound argument is in a minute. It's not a sound argument, but it is a valid argument. And to see that, we just need to review our definition of valid. And we said that a valid deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Well, let's look at this argument then. If the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, and if Paris is in the UK, well then certainly it's true that the Eiffel Tower is in the UK. So this is a valid argument, a valid deductive argument according to our definitions in philosophy. And this is why we need to be really careful with the usual English use of the word valid, because that can be very general and it can just mean a good argument, whereas of course this isn't a good argument by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a valid argument in that you have the situation where if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And so you can express this sort of validity property like this. You can say that in a valid argument, the conclusion follows from the premises. The logical reasoning in the argument works. It sort of all ticks over neatly and reaches its conclusion in a sort of logical way. The conclusion follows from the premises. Still, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good argument. As we've seen, here's a valid argument which we wouldn't want to accept, and no one would really want to accept that. But nevertheless, in this argument, we can say the conclusion follows from the premises. So what we can say is then that validity is a desirable property for our deductive arguments we're putting forward. We want them to be valid. We want the logical reasoning to work like that. In the argument, we want the conclusion to flow from the premises. But with this example of the Eiffel Tower argument, you can see that validity on its own is not enough. We need to further sort of distinguish those deductive arguments that we're sort of happy with, that really fully work successfully, that we wish to sort of accept and hold up as a standard. And this brings us on then to the idea of a sound deductive argument. So as we note, so we want them to be valid, but we also want them to be sound as well. We want them to be sound. So what is the definition of a sound deductive argument? Well, we have it there. A sound deductive argument is a valid argument in which all the premises are true. So a valid argument, a sound argument is already valid. You've got that built into the definition. So as soon as you know an argument deductive argument is sound, you know it is valid. But you also know one other thing about it. There is something else in that definition there. So not only is it valid, but all the premises are true. That's when you have a sound argument. Now, hopefully, if a moment's reflection, and it is worth taking the time to think about this carefully and sort of run this through in your head and see how the definitions work. As stated in this point here, if the conclusion follows from the premises and the premises are all true, then we'll get a true conclusion. Because if we have the argument being valid, then we know from our definition of validity that a valid argument is one where if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And we know in the case of a sound argument that the premises are true. So they are true, and so then the conclusion must be true from the validity property. So we can say that all sound arguments succeed in establishing their conclusion. That's certainly true. This is what we're aiming for, really, putting forward a deductive argument. Not all deductive arguments are sound. Some have certain flaws or issues with them. They fall short of being sound arguments, but that's what we really want. We want a nice valid argument where the reasoning sort of is flowing in the argument, and we get our conclusion following certainly from our premises. And additionally, we want our premises to be true, so that that sort of truth is, in a way, sort of metaphorically transmitted through the argument to the conclusion. And here's a wonderful Microsoft Paint diagram illustrating the relationship between these definitions we've been looking at. If we were to consider the class of all deductive arguments, within that you would have some of them, a subset there, the next circle in the valid deductive arguments. So, and what's on the outside of that valid deductive argument circle? Well, of course, that is the invalid ones are outside. So those are certain class within all of the deductive arguments. That's the class of valid deductive arguments. And then within that, an even smaller class is the class of sound deductive arguments, because we know that all sound deductive arguments, they are valid deductive arguments, because being sound, part of the definition of being a sound deductive argument is that it is valid. And then you have the additional property that the premises are also true in the case of a sound argument. Finally today, let's look at how to criticize deductive arguments. So according to the type of argument we're dealing with, we may have, or we do have, slightly different approaches to criticizing them, to evaluating them. And so we're going to look at that a bit now. And when it comes to deductive arguments, there are two general methods we can use to criticize them. And the first method is to show that at least one premise in the argument is false. And the second method is to show that the deductive argument is invalid. And either one, as we'll see, will be a worthy criticism of the deductive argument. So let's turn to the first method, the first way to begin with, this method of showing that at least one premise is false. In fact, this method works for all three major types of argument that we are going to look at. It's the second type, the second method that differs between the argument between the types of arguments, say the deductive, inductive, and abductive, because they work in different ways. So we can criticize them in different ways. But this method works for all the different types of arguments we might consider on the philosophy course. You can always, if you don't like an argument, if you want to criticize an argument, always look to see carefully, are there any premises that are vulnerable, any premises that you can maybe show are false, and to strike a blow against that argument. Let's look at an argument here that we can show how this works. Premise 1, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Premise 2, Paris is in the UK. And then the conclusion, Paris is in the UK. We can point out, as we did before, that premise 2 is false, because Paris is not in the UK. So in this case, what we see is that the argument is valid but not sound, because it's valid if you do accept premise 1 and premise 2, you must accept the conclusion with certainty. But it's not sound because in a sound argument, all the premises are true, and we've seen that P2 in this case is false. And the falsity of P2 it also leads, in the argument to the conclusion being false. So in this case, if we criticize that premise, then we can show that this leads to this false P2 leads us to a false conclusion. So very often you can criticize any premise in an argument and in a deductive argument, and you can, provided all the premises are supporting the conclusion, leading to the conclusion, showing any one to be false should sort of wreck the truth of the conclusion, at least potentially. So do look to the premises carefully in deductive argument. If you don't like what the conclusion is, you don't like the argument, is there any way to show that any of them are false? And then this very often will undermine the argument in a big way. The other method of criticizing deductive argument is to focus on the validity of the argument. It's one of the reasons why we distinguished valid deductive arguments and invalid deductive arguments. What you want to do here really is to show that the argument is not valid. In fact, it's an invalid deductive argument. And of course, if it's invalid, that would mean then the conclusion doesn't follow with certainty from the premises. In fact, someone could accept the premises and wouldn't necessarily have to accept the conclusion. So let's see how this works. So considering this argument here, premise 1, if I owned all the gold in England, I'd be a wealthy man. Premise 2, I don't own all the gold in England. And the conclusion, therefore, I'm not a wealthy man. And I don't know if you can see this, and we're going to explain it, but if you think about this carefully, hopefully you can see that it's not a valid argument. Even if you accept premise 1, even if that's true, if you accept it, even if premise 2 is true and you accept it, you don't need to accept conclusion. You can still reject the conclusion. And so what that means is it's failed our definition of validity. It is in fact an invalid deductive argument. So how does that work? What would we say, perhaps in an answer or an exam, to sort of support that? You'd want to outline, how it is that it is invalid. And in this case, we'd say the reason why the conclusion doesn't follow with certainty is essentially because there are other ways to be wealthy. It's not the case that you have to own all the gold in England to be wealthy. For example, you might own all the cash in England instead, rather than all the gold. And I think if you owned all the cash in England, by any standard, you would be considered a wealthy man as well. So what this shows is that you might say, yes, I agree with premise 1. If I owned all the gold in England, I'd be a wealthy man. Yes, it's true, I accept it. And premise 2, I don't own all the gold in England. So I accept that. But even though I accept premise 1 and premise 2, I do not accept the conclusion, because it may not be that in that case I'm not a wealthy man, because I may own all the cash in England, all the shares in England, all the land in England, or something else that makes me wealthy. So what we have done here is we've shown that it's not valid. We've shown it doesn't meet the definition of a valid deductive argument, and we actually fleshed that out a bit by looking at the argument, the points it's making, and outlining a situation where premise 1 and premise 2 might be true, and yet the conclusion is not necessarily true, and we've shown it's not valid. So certainly in the case of an argument that's not valid, well then the conclusion doesn't follow with certainty, and you really have attacked the argument. You've shown that the logical reasoning in the argument breaks down. So that brings us to the end of our introduction to deductive arguments. I say introduction because there's much more to say about arguments, and the further examples we're going to give, and many deductive arguments we're going to look at on the course. This is one of the famous 3 types of argument that you are required to know on the A-level course. And we've seen a definition of that, and we've seen some examples. We've seen how you can further classify them as invalid, valid, and sound, and what those words mean with examples as well. And we've looked at how you can criticize a deductive argument. So thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, queries, comments, opinions, please do leave a comment below. And for more A-level philosophy videos, hit subscribe, and there's more to come.
Geometry a pill of his own free will, on half-one Shandy was particularly ill. Later they say he could sing it away. Half a grade of whiskey every day. Aristotle was a bagger for the bottle. Hobbes was fond of his dram, and Rennie Descartes was a drunken fart. I drink, therefore I am.